Well, good afternoon. My name is Alberto Vargas. I welcome all of you to our lecture today. I'm the Associate Director of the Latin American, Caribbean, and Iberian Studies Program here at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Martina Kunovic. Dr. Kunovic just obtained her Ph.D. here at the University of Wisconsin in sociology. She has a master's also in sociology from McGill University and a bachelor's also in sociology and media studies from Western University in London, Ontario. Martina is going to share with us some of her research for her recently obtained doctorate for her dissertation. And please join me to welcome Martina. Welcome, Martina.
Thank you, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here. Lofties has been a great supporter of my graduate work and time in the field. I actually did this research back in, well, the long stint of field work, 2015 and 2016, lots of pre-field work before then with the Tinker-Nave support from Lofties. And so I'm really happy to be sharing out the final product, which I did just defend in January. This is still fresh. So I'm going to paint in broad strokes. I get not into too much empirical detail here because I want to paint the overall picture. And it is, of course, a snapshot. Things have changed, and I'm looking forward to having that discussion afterwards. So I'm going to launch right in so we have time for questions and discussion there. Just, I'm interested though, like who here has been to Cuba? Okay. Or feels pretty familiar with Cuba's history, or okay. Stop me if you need clarifying questions along the way, but we'll leave the discussion for the end. Okay. So in late 2010, the Cuban government announced a revised economic development strategy for the country, which they euphemistically referred to as an updating of the country's social and economic model. And they were clear that despite the changes that were being introduced, they were committed to the continuity, as they called it, and irreversibility of socialism. In analyzing the documents, so that's one of the documents that was handed out, it was debated widely in workers' meetings across the island, and then taken to the 6th Communist Party Congress in April 2011, and over 300 guidelines for reform were approved or adopted. And analysts have noted that it signaled really a marked transformation in the role of the state vis-a-vis its citizens, even though the idea was to preserve socialism, right? So we see a shifting division of labor between the public sphere of the state and the private sphere of specifically families and individuals. Whereas Cuba's revolutionary government played a really strong role in social welfare provision in the decades following the 1959 Cuban Revolution, it started to scale back its social welfare provision. And this really started even in the 1990s with the onset of the special period, which was the economic crisis that Cuba went through after the fall of the Soviet bloc, right? Cuba's largest trading partner and ideological ally. So the state even then had started to roll back some provisions that were more universal and be a little bit more selective in terms of welfare provisions. And this really continued and accelerated with 2010 reforms. So as one example of this, the Cuban government reduced spending for social welfare by over $386 million between 2008 and 2011. And it was providing social welfare to almost 400,000 fewer recipients in 2011 as compared to 2008. They also gradually cut back, for example, on the quantity of items provided through the monthly ration card, and even discussed eliminating it altogether, although they haven't. But really, the reforms that I want to highlight that speak to this changing division of labor between the public and private sphere is, one, the dramatic expansion of private employment. When I say private employment, specifically in Cuba, especially at that time, it was restricted to like small scale family businesses and cooperatives. We're not talking like multinational companies coming in. That's still all through like state joint ventures. And also, and this is really the focus of my presentation, the lifting of restrictions on housing sale. So on November 10th, 2011, a new property law allowed free market sales between individuals for the first time in over 50 years. So home sales had been effectively banned following the Cuban Revolution through the Urban Reform Law of 1960. Technically, they weren't banned altogether. The state had the right of first refusal, right? So first the state decided whether or not to purchase it, and sales prices were limited to a really artificially low legal price. So they weren't outrightly banned, but effectively they were, right? A few notes on this like legalization of home sales. There were still some restrictions. So people, first of all, foreigners can't legally own, right? It's for Cubans and permanent residents only, who are allowed to own one home in their name in a city and one vacation or beach home. There's no mortgage financing available, and it's actually prohibited on your first home. Technically, you could have it on your second home. Not many people do. It's not a robust mortgage infrastructure. And so there's still some restrictions. This isn't like a rampant free market, but it is a major difference that now people decide on the sales price of their home, negotiate it, and simply go and register it, right? They'll go to the notary and they'll pay the taxes just like you'd see in other places. Something to know historically, and I have a whole chapter of this in the dissertation, which will fill in some gaps. And if you need to, please do ask, but just a quick, right? The revolutionary government that came in 1959 in power in Cuba really transformed the country from a nation of renters to a nation of homeowners. So according to the 1953 census, which was the last census taken before the Cuban Revolution, 36%, the homeownership rate stood at 36%. And that over the series of reforms, notably the 1960 Urban Reform Law, and then a pair of general housing laws in 1984 and 1988, got the homeownership rate up to 85%, which was way higher compared to countries in the region, but also OECD nations during that time. It's stood around there. The latest estimate in 2018 was at 88%. I've heard some go as high as 90. Cuba's really up there in terms of homeownership rate. But what did it mean, right? Given that people owned their homes, but they were unable to sell them, right, at prices that they determined. And this was purposeful, right? The revolutionary government really emphasized the use value or the social function of homes and not the exchange value, right? Not the monetary value. Homes, in their words, were like primarily a place to live rather than a place to live from. So Cubans living on the island, I mentioned this. Why is this important, right? Why is this change important? Basically, what I'm arguing is that the economic restructuring that started in the 1990s as a response to the special period crisis, but really accelerated through the most recent wave of reforms that were being introduced since 2010, has radically transformed structures of mobility for Cubans. Given the challenges to amassing savings in Cuba, especially for those employed in the state sector, which was the primary employer up until recently, and also given that the state is selectively pulling back its role in terms of social welfare provision, the ability to provide for the ability of Cubans to provide for themselves and their families is very much shaped and influenced by housing, I argue. So whereas previously we saw traditional pathways to mobility through education, right? Which was related to occupational mobility, especially in like the early decades after the revolution, as the elites left the island and we had a large like class of white collar professions to fill. So we saw lots of training programs for doctors, right, and other professionals and people coming from humble origins able to take advantage of universal free education, including post-secondary education, and move into those professions and see some occupational mobility. Even though the country still like had a compressed pay scale, so that didn't play out necessarily in like wide discrepancies, but compared to their previous position, they saw mobility compared to their life, for example, their parents or themselves prior to the revolution. That started changing in the 1990s, right? Where economic capital gained more currency in terms of who had access to hard currency when this dual monetary system was introduced. And people who had money being sent from abroad, remittances, were able to purchase in dollar stores, right? More prized goods. People who worked in jobs for tourism or other access like to hard currency, which would be musicians or performers, people that go abroad, physicians or dentists on international missions, et cetera, right? But they were in a much better place than people in the state sphere. So to come back to housing, I argue that housing in like this post-2010 era has really become central to the structure of opportunity. In addition to access to hard currency that we started seeing in the 1990s. So with the announcement of the legalization of home sales and the opening of the real estate market, we virtually overnight saw previously unvalued or undervalued properties become assets and potential sources of wealth, right? Which could be used both for social welfare provision, but also for social mobility. And this is one of the things I really draw attention to in my dissertation, the idea that housing is not only a reflection of one's social class or an expression of social mobility, as traditional understandings usually have it, but it also is a means to social mobility. And I'll talk exactly about how that works in this presentation. And of course, this is all within the context that the fact that housing has become so central to the new structure of opportunity in the post-2010 era is both a direct outcome of the recommodification of housing. And when I say recommodification of housing, I'm referring to two parts. One, obviously like the sale of homes when they have exchange value, not just use value, but also commodifying housing in the sense of being able to use it for business purposes, given like the expansion of private employment, which I'll talk about in a second more. But it's also a direct outcome of the state's selective retrenchment in social welfare provision, such that people have to look to other means for their own social welfare provision. There are two overarching ways in which Cubans use their housing to ensure their welfare and to pursue social mobility strategies. One is the straightforward converting the wealth that's stored in their home into cash through selling it, right? That seems pretty straightforward. Bringing it to practice is a little bit more difficult, right? People still need a place to live unless they're emigrating or moving in with family, but given that already like multiple generations tend to live together in Cuba, that's oftentimes not an option, right? And the second way that they use their housing for social welfare provision and mobility is by using their home to generate sustained income. So setting up a business within their home or renting their home to someone who wants to do so, right? And here, many possibilities exist from small like nail salons, fixing small electrical appliances, et cetera. But really the most lucrative of this is, and that's why I asked if anyone has been, a lot of people that go to Cuba stay like, well, now we all know what is Airbnb. It existed way before Airbnb, the Airbnb platform did, right? But you stay with a local family, right? Instead of in a hotel. So this renting rooms in Cuba, they call that casa particulares, or restaurants. Those were like the two original kind of more popular forms in the 1990s when there was this opening to some with lots of restrictions, private employment in order to get people through the economic crisis. And then it was like retrenched again and then really expanded in a new way since 2010. So these possibilities, of course, exist, at least theoretically, but the ability of Cubans to actually use their newly recommodified homes for social welfare provision and social mobility is, as we could probably expect, highly uneven across the population. It depends on a number of factors, but I'm going to highlight a few here. And of course, so you could sell your home to extract the wealth that's stored in it. But then the question arises, how much wealth is stored in your home, which depends in turn on a variety of factors, right? And how are you or are you not able to access it through selling? Even though it's a legal option, a lot of people run into barriers and their house stays on the market for months, years, unable to sell. There's also the question of the suitability of the home for a business, specifically lucrative income generating activities such as room rentals or restaurants, which are largely geared towards foreigners, right? International tourists. So this question of what kind of home is suitable to host them. And these two factors in turn are related to other factors, and I want to highlight two of them. One is whether the home, this is a little bit more peculiar to Cuba or post-socialist countries, whether the home is what they would call a capitalist home, right? Construcción capitalista, or a socialist construction. And the idea is that the capitalist built homes, so those homes built prior to 1950, right? In the first half of the 1900s, are generally regarded as more valuable due to presumed and also actual higher quality of construction. So here's a picture of like socialist homes. I took this one. This one's actually just a media photo. But for anyone familiar who's been to like post-socialist countries, this is like these prefabricated constructions in this 4 to 5 story walk-up buildings that look very uniform. This one actually has some color on it, but a lot of it's like gray. We have entire sections of Havana, Alamar being one neighborhood that is populated by these micro brigade buildings, they're called, and these are state constructions. And highly undesirable, right? Even by the residents. So they provided people with housing, but now they're finding that they're not able to convert this type of housing into opportunities for social mobility in this day and age. So that's one factor, whether the house is capitalist or socialist construction. And another is the location of the home, right? Whether it is in an area of Havana with high tourist activity specifically, which increases its sales value and makes it more lucrative to set up the types of businesses that could generate good revenues, like I mentioned. And so this here is a map of, this is actually 2 geographers mapped this out based on data from February 2021. And they plotted with these purple dots all of the Airbnbs that are advertised as entire homes. So these aren't like private rooms within a home, entire homes being rented out. And so Havana is much larger than this, but to give you an idea, the concentration is in these coastal areas, right? Which are the areas of high tourist interest. We have Old Havana, the historical center here, Centro Havana, which is generally regarded as a deteriorating neighborhood, but lays between 2 very popular neighborhoods and still receives a lot of activity. You'll see on the next slide, this is called Plaza, but it contains El Vedado, which is a historically bourgeoisie neighborhood, again, high tourist activity. And then over here in this area it's called Playa. It's not that the beaches are actually over there, that the sand beaches, but this area called Playa contains Miramar, which these are the areas, especially Miramar, that received, even from the state, heavy investment in tourist infrastructure. So hotels, initially like state restaurants and conference centers, et cetera, that were invested in, and then the people who had housing in those areas benefited, right, from both the increased tourist activity, meaning more business for them, but also when the time came to sell homes, right? The homes in these areas were more valuable, as we could see in this next slide. These are the same geographers who actually looked at an analysis of listings, and the darker kind of red to orange areas, that's where homes have higher values. So they priced it per, that's right, if it's meter squared or square meter. Square meter. I always get those mixed up. So again, we see the same pattern, right? In those areas, homes tend to be valued higher compared to other areas of Havana. And Havana expands out this way. And this way over here, you don't have all of it on the map, but really these four municipalities, Havana Vieja, Centro Havana, Plaza, and Playa, contain, let me get the exact quote for you, 2/3 of rental licenses in Havana were concentrated in these four municipalities. And these four municipalities only house about 1/4, 26.4% to be exact, of Havana's population. You can see the difference there. And so these two factors, whether it's capitalist or socialist construction, and whether the location of the home, really shape whether one's home serves as a means or a barrier to social mobility and this new structure of opportunity. And yet, of course, they're largely outside of the control of individuals, right? A lot of this is due to like chance, historical, like legacy in terms of where they ended up. And so I argue that while the Cuban state provided many Cubans with a place to live, for example, through those microbate constructions, and created a nation of homeowners and did so at heavily subsidized prices, those Cubans living in units built by the socialist state and are outside of tourist areas generally find themselves much more limited in using their housing for social mobility in a context in which housing has become recommodified. So within the recommodification of housing, disparities in the exchange value of homes and housing conditions took on new relevance, right? This, of course, has existed this whole time, but now it not only affects the daily life of individuals and families, but also shapes the prospects for inserting themselves into a lucrative sector of the emerging economy. So next we come to the elusive question of which social groups are better positioned to use the recommodification of housing for upward social mobility, and which groups are systematically limited or entirely excluded from doing so. And there's a lot of data limitations that preclude sort of a clear-cut answer to this question. But I pieced together available evidence in my dissertation that suggests that racial and economic inequalities that the revolution fought hard to eliminate are being reinscribed through housing in some ways, but also disrupted in others. And so I have an entire chapter on this question of like winners and losers. And there's a lot that goes into this, but to give like the brief synopsis, right? The winners are a little bit harder to tell than the losers, but given the way that housing was historically acquired or distributed since the revolution, we find that a relatively small group of pre-revolutionary elites who actually stayed in Cuba and didn't immigrate. We always hear about those left, and it was a significant portion, but a small portion that stayed in Cuba were able to retain their homes, right? Those homes weren't nationalized. They were able to retain their homes, and so they have these like higher valued homes, but also revolutionary leaders, right? So people who fought in the revolution, a lot of whom came from like the eastern part of the island, were assigned housing from the people who left, right? And those houses were nationalized from the exiles, emigres, depending on the language that you decide to use. So they were assigned some of the nicer homes. But we also have examples. We don't have statistics, so we do have tons of anecdotes of families of more humble origin acquiring housing in some of those neighborhoods that today command higher prices. To the extent that these groups remained in these homes, they were well positioned then to take advantage of the new opportunities for social mobility that became available in the post-2010 period. But at least some evidence suggests that during the 1990s, people with access to hard currency, remember from jobs in tourism, or international missions and remittances from abroad, that some of them at least were illegally purchasing on the black market some of these homes, right? So even then, some of these families from more humble origins who could not maintain the homes or needed to come into some extra cash, especially during the difficult economic times, sold their homes, not for much, right? They would be worth a lot more now. So to the extent that that happened, and it's hard to trace, right? We find examples of specific families, but there isn't good data to give us like an idea of quantities about that. But there is, other scholars have done work that have shown that the people who receive these remittances and oftentimes benefited from like private employment in the 1990s tended to be predominantly white. So that's like some of the racial aspect, although we need a lot more research there. The losers in this like recommodified housing system with the new structure of social mobility, I argue, are those who are, of course, excluded from home ownership, and specifically those who live in tenements. By tenements, I mean, there's different terms for them, but basically they tend to be one-room apartments, which originally had the bathroom and kitchen outside and shared with other units, right, off of a common corridor. Many of them have actually built that into their spaces now, so they have it within, but historically that's kind of what the tenements are referred to. And this pattern already existed before the revolution, but we still see it to this day, that those who tend to populate tenements are largely Afro-Cuban and poor, and are today finding themselves unable to use their housing as a means of social mobility. So, of course, there's this issue of, let's revisit like what I mean by the commodification of housing. One, the right to rent rooms, or setting up businesses in your home. That's one way housing is recommodified. But the right to rent rooms or really any space in your house is limited to homeowners. So you won't be issued a license if you're in one of those places, which, okay, so brief historical lesson. We saw those low income and Afro-Cubans renting prior to the revolution in the cities, right? In these tenement buildings. The revolution comes in and through a series of measures, reduces rents, freezes evictions, and eventually gives rights to the occupants, right? So it expropriates the landlords, and the occupants are allowed to remain in these tenements to live, initially with like paying a very, very small rent to the government, but eventually living rent-free. So this is like the usufruct form of tenure, and they're allowed to stay for life, but there are these certain restrictions, and those restrictions were justified in the sense of these places have low habitability because they don't have interior bathrooms. The space is smaller than 25 square meters, and kitchens inside, right? So the idea was that eventually these would become homeowners, but this has been a chronic issue in Cuba that never really happened. And steps keep being reintroduced to make it happen, but basically these people, even though they had a more secure tenure status compared to exploitative, when they were under the rule of exploitative landlords, now they're finding themselves in a more limited position. And of course, they can't sell either. So they can't rent out their space, but also the space isn't oftentimes suitable for such because it is a small one-room place where the whole family lives, right? So it's not suitable for setting up most businesses, that at least not with like lucrative potentials or geared towards foreigners. So another question, so that's the question in terms of like who are winners and losers. Related to that question is like who's actually buying residential properties in Havana, right? And through my fieldwork, I found unsurprisingly that the emerging real estate market in Havana is highly stratified. So the recommodification of housing in Cuba presented, of course, exciting opportunities for social mobility for Cubans. And we heard about this in the international press, and people made a lot of these new reforms. But the reality is that many Cubans are unable to capitalize on these new opportunities. And they find themselves stuck in place, both physically, right? And in terms of social mobility. So lack of mortgage financing and generally low salaries in the state sector, especially, has created a situation in which average Cubans must first sell their own home before being able to purchase another, which largely precludes those, of course, who do not already own a home from entering the market. And among homeowners, makes especially consequential differences in the exchange value of their homes, right? Okay, so I could sell, but what could I buy with whatever I'm selling? This also creates these long chains of dependency that depend on an initial injection of capital, which usually comes from one of three groups I found through my research outside of Cuba. One is foreigners, but these are usually foreigners with ties to Cuba, friends, lovers, right, who are in Cuba, because recall that foreigners can't legally own, except for in designated condominiums, which are like North American prices, and it's not a deal for them, right? So foreigners with ties to Cuba is one category. The other is repatriating Cubans. So this was another amongst the reforms that Cuba allowed people who had lost residency status, Cubans who had lost residency status, to reapply. And it was quite straightforward to reapply and become a resident and gain all the rights, including access to the healthcare system, being able to own property, cars, etc. And the third category is for that initial injection is Cuban immigrants who have still family and friends on the island. So they're not returning to live on the island, but they have close ties. And so these are the buyers I found that really are purchasing the medium to the high value properties. And the sellers of those properties from whom they purchase generally then purchase lower valued properties, and that's how you go down the chain, right? While those who don't own properties, and especially young people, right? So young couples forming families, find themselves generally excluded from the market altogether. And this has created a highly stratified real estate market in which Cubans who have genuine housing needs are unable to compete with those with access to hard currency. And the three categories that I mentioned of folks, right? These are not like international investors. Like I said, I emphasize the foreigners have ties to Cuba. These are not super wealthy individuals, usually from other places. These could be like middle class or some people with some extra cash. There's a wide range. Because housing in Cuba, and I don't include this in the presentation, there's of course a wide range of values, but what you could get for even at that time, like 50,000, 80,000 would be like a nice Catholic apartment in one of those areas of town that were, and of course, like we do see 200,000, 300,000, 500,000, and even $1 million properties as well. There is a tendency for buyers from outside of Cuba to purchase properties in order to convert them into tourist-oriented private businesses, such as short-term home or room or home rentals and restaurant, right? Those being the two most lucrative categories, at least at the time. And what we're seeing then is that this is exacerbating a dire housing shortage in Havana and also potentially re-stratifying neighborhoods in the form of income and race. So the housing shortage in Cuba has been chronic. It's been a thorn in the side of the revolution, like Fidel's initial speeches before he came to power. We were going to tackle it. But this is an ongoing problem with difficult solutions. So it's by official estimates, this is like admitted by the Cuban government. At the end of 2018, they were estimating close to 929,000 units short was the housing shortage. And to put this in context, Cuba has 11.2 million inhabitants and a housing stock of 3.8 million units. So 1 million housing shortage is quite a number. Growing inequality between Cubans who receive remittances in hard currency, of course, and those that must live from their wages in the local currency has been noted already since the introduction of the dual currency system in 1993, but it takes on new meaning and becomes especially consequential in the context of this specifically business-oriented investment in Havana, right? So given that transnational connections and remittances are increasing, this is part of it. Like they found that remittances in the 1990s, even though I said some people were using them for, and people who had access to hard currency to like purchase some properties in the black market, still at that time, they were mostly being used for like basic consumption, right? And then we see Emilio Morales and others have like, who really concentrated on remittances, have tracked this, that they're increasingly being used for discretionary spending and business-oriented investment, like the post-2008, especially post-2010 era. And so, given, as I was saying, that transnational connections and remittances are increasingly being used to fund businesses, the inequalities between Cubans who receive remittances and those who do not is also growing and taking on new meanings, right? And as I said, in Cuba, anyone who studies it knows that representative racial statistics on anything, including business owners, are not publicly available. But research by the Cuban historian Alejandro de la Fuente has shown that remittance receivers tend to be lighter skinned, which suggests that there is this racial dimension to this growing inequality, which is now being inscribed on the territory of Havana. So to kind of sum it up, right, we're seeing this new changing structure of opportunity in Cuba, moving away from traditional models in terms of educational and occupational mobility towards the emphasis on economic capital and specifically like housing being right at the center of it. I think I'm going to stop there looking at the clock just so that we have some time to chat and ask questions. And will you,
Right.
Thank you. Will you moderate or should I?
Yeah.
Let me know if there's.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much, Martina, for your presentation. So we're gonna open it for questions. If there's someone here in the room who would like to ask a question, or somebody from the audience in Zoom who would like to open their mic and just ask a question, please go ahead. There's any question here? There are a couple questions here. You want to come here? Good. Yeah.
Go ahead.
So, yeah. Yeah.
Oh, to ask a question. I didn't realize. Okay, yeah.
I guess I had two questions. My first question would be, so Cubans can now own more than one house, or is it still kept at two houses?
It is still, so one house in the city and one in the beach or countryside.
And I was wondering, like, so is there no way for like Cubans to build multi-story apartments then to rent out? Like, could it be like, I know like one of the exceptions you mentioned with like a cooperative, and I wonder if like all those cooperatives tend to be more grocery oriented. Are there any sort of institutions that would allow for like Cubans to come together to build a multiple like condominium or apartment style building in order to rent out and generate income?
Good question. Yeah. Legally, no. But it is happening. Not so much building from scratch, like on empty lots. You don't see like new developments. What you do see is, even though the restrictions exist in terms of the number of homes that folks could own, people find creative ways around that. So they put it in the name of their spouse and child and brother and etc. And then like the family kind of owns all of those properties. Now, there's always the question, it's not legally in your name. And the same thing happens with foreigners, right? They're buying, but they're putting in the name of the person who has legal rights to it, the Cuban, but you have these informal arrangements. So it's actually yours and that's known. So what happens when relationships dissolve is like one of the questions. Which this was still relatively new when I was researching like 2015, 2016. And a lot of these like sales were rather fresh and the relationship still intact. But that's like an interesting question to track. But in terms of like, yeah, building, it's more converting or rehabilitating at this point rather than building from scratch. So I actually, it's not in this presentation, have a photo of like one place in Centro Havana, which openly was advertising. You don't really see that the whole building was being sold. right? Usually that happens, but they don't advertise it on the sign, right? And other things that people do, especially these like casa particular owners, the Airbnb owners, add to their business, right? Expand it by acquiring additional properties, including some of those, like, this is the interesting part about the tenements. While the families living within them can't, oftentimes it's not suitable, right? There will be people who, and I saw this, like, will, in my empirical research, buy the home out and rent it as like, redo it and rent it as an individual apartment. And none of that's legal. You could pay someone to like legalize it on paperwork, right? To like convert it from a usufruct to a property with title. But that takes a lot of maneuvering and connections and all that. But so things are happening where people are like amassing more properties, but it's not in the sense of building. Did that kind of answer the question?
Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. It seems like you got a lot of information for your dissertation, and I'm curious about the data collection process. Yes. I did interference, but I can't really concentrate. Thanks. What kind of data sources did you have, and what was the process like? Did you do like documentational research, or did you do interviews or informal conversations with people? And how long did it take? What kind of challenges did you face as far as availability of data or restrictions on information? That's my question.
Yes. I didn't go over the data and methods here because I'm painting this in broad strokes, so I didn't get into a lot of the empirical stuff. But yeah, this was a largely qualitative study based on interviews. So with homeowners, home buyers, and I actually interviewed a lot of real estate agents and agencies, which is also like a new profession that was permitted under the expansion of private employment. So they were acted more as informants of like what's going on. They're both licensed and unlicensed, et cetera. So I did about 70 interviews, formal interviews, and a lot more informal conversations and ethnographic observations. So embedded myself specifically with the mostly unlicensed, informal, like historically present real estate agents on this. Basically, it's a public park. It's like a popular promenade, and that's where people have historically gone, which I didn't mention this in the presentation. People did, of course, move before you could buy and sell homes, and they did so through a process of swapping. So they'd have to register on like swap equivalent units, but you weren't allowed to compensate people for unequal units. It was like according to your need, you swap. And so these folks that now were selling, like historically, they had arranged the swaps. So I embedded myself with them and had ethnographic observation that way. I also, surprisingly, because I was registered, so in Cuba, some scholars go and just do research, but that's a little bit tricky. You need a research visa and from an authorized Cuban institute. And so I affiliated myself with an anthropological institute that they actually provided me with letters of introduction to get into like formal places. So the number I mentioned on like licenses and percentages, that was actually like restricted data that I had been given by like, the Office of Work, Dirección de Trabajo, but in terms of like, and actually they gave me like really detailed data, I think by accident, in terms of like demographic data of the people holding the licenses, and even like names and ID numbers that were like not unidentified, and other things. So it was like a combination of document analysis, ethnography, and interviews.
You have a question, Michael? You want to open your mic?
Yes. Martina, hello. We met many years ago when you started your research.
Michael Martin.
Yes, in
Havana. Michael, yes. And we saw each other in
I
Havana.
am wondering, one, is your dissertation available?
To you, if you email me, yes.
I will get a hold of you.
Not-
And
Published on ProQuest, but yes, it's uploaded, but I have an embargo on it. But yes, I'm happy to share it with you.
because I've been waiting to see how this all turned out. I don't think people understand how kind of cutting edge this kind of research is. It's wonderful. And I'm also very fascinated by your comments about race. The nature of how the original waves of immigration with money favored whiter Cubans, and then the remittances favor whiter Cubans. This all seems pretty logical. I'm wondering if you've got any information or any insights into the underground. And when the average Cuban makes 40 to 50 to 60 bucks a month, being able to buy a house, I think you had a projection of 1,000 years worth of salary to be able to afford a house in one of the presentations I saw you did before. Is there anything written or talked about in terms of the underground market?
I mean, it popped up everywhere in my research in terms of there's not a lot written on housing markets, like the real estate market in Cuba in general. There's like a chapter in a book by Hope Bastian, but it doesn't go into much empirical detail. And then even Cuban scholars, I didn't go into this. You asked me about challenges earlier. Like my research almost got shut down at the beginning because housing is such a sensitive issue in Cuba, as you know, right? So Cuban scholars as well, there's been like these general references to possible racial and economic inequalities, but no, like there's not a study that I can point you to. In terms that you were asking about the underground market, there is an underground market in terms of the sales of tenements, right? I said people aren't legally allowed to sell them. And it's a lot of people coming from like the eastern provinces who tend to be darker skinned and don't have other places to stay inside Havana are buying on the outskirts of town or in these tenements, which tend to be at this point, because of lack of maintenance, as you know, right? Severely run down and with severe structural issues, given that people have been building in order to accommodate growing families or even like their own family in terms of like trying to separate sleeping quarters by adding like an intermediate layer, a barbacoa as they call it, or including just putting in like too much structural weight, right? In terms of like added kitchens and bathrooms, etc. So these places, yes, they are being sold. There is an active, and they're like in the range of $3,000, $4,000, $5,000, depending on location, and up to like $8,000 if they're in better shape and really centrally located. And that's like more on the accessible end because, of course, like what's not being mentioned, yes, the formal salary in Cuba is really low, like 30, at this point it's a little bit more, like 40 or 50 per month for a state salary, but in reality, no one lives off of their state salary, or like very few people live off of their state salary. They find like ways to scrap money together in terms of selling things on the black market, either pilfered from work or from like trips abroad that they bring, merchandise to sell, etc., and a variety of other factors. And there is like a large literature on that in terms of how people patch together strategies to get by. I don't know if that answered what was exactly your question.
General conversation. There's not many Cuban housing researchers I can talk to. The last time I was on the island, there was some discussion about, and this is coming from Cubans and Cuban academics, so you have to take it for what it's worth, of the regeneration of wealth through Casa Particulares and through the Paladares that were, that the privatization of the market is self-generating money to be able to buy, especially in Centro. And so that's, kind of the regeneration of wealth thing. How long can you keep a dollar in a neighborhood type thing? That seems rather neat. But how long do we have to wait till the book comes out? your book. Are you going to publish?
Hey, you can't see, something else has to come out first and then we'll see.
Oh,
I'm about 2 weeks away.
congratulations.
So I don't have a timeline for the book yet. I have a more imminent timeline. But we should connect, Michael. Reconnect.
I would
Okay.
like that very much.
Okay, so someone sent in, Christian sent in a message in the chat. I haven't yet read it. Here I go. Cuba is famous for the barbacoa, level splitting constructions within dwellings to reinvent space. Do these factor in how dwellings may get divided or sold at all? For example, can owners informally sell this invented space, a floor, but keep ownership of the building itself or anything similar? So the barbacoa level splitting constructions within dwellings to reinvent space. A lot of people use the barbacoa. So these are like in colonial buildings with tall ceilings, they'll put in an intermediate floor, oftentimes to have separate sleeping spaces, especially like in these tenements. I haven't seen it. I've seen it mostly used like that within the single family rather than closed off and like a separate entrance and just that part being sold. I've heard a lot of frustration from buyers in terms of people advertising like a 2-level home and them going in and realizing it's a barbacoa, like not what they would consider a 2-level home. So in my own research, I haven't come across owners informally selling just that invented space. People do sell, rights to their roof for people to build on top. That's something separate, right? Even like before, people would sell those rights informally, right? Let them build on their land. So we did see that, but not specific to the barbacoa, as you asked. It might exist. I just didn't come across it in my research.
All right, thank you. Any other questions here from the room? I have a couple of questions. We could have a few minutes. Martina, well, thank you for your great presentation. Two questions. How is the Cuban government handling the amount of data and record keeping and their cadastral system? Is there anything going on in that regard? And also another question could be like in Cuba, hurricane-prone area, what happened to people that are displaced from their homes because of a natural disaster or things like that?
Yeah.
You can comment on that.
So I'll start with the second about hurricane relief. Yes. Cuba, and that's part of like that chronic housing shortage that I've mentioned. The constant hurricanes certainly don't help, and the government they haven't entirely stopped constructing homes. There's still an estimate around 20,000 per year, but there's an expectation that people will construct for themselves, and new programs like for the most needy in terms of subsidies for building materials, making building materials more widely available so people could construct on their own, or at least like rehabilitate homes. So there is a concentration and priority given to hurricane victims and people in structurally unsound buildings. So these buildings that haven't been maintained in a long time and are in danger of collapse, they'll get a notice that it's dangerous to live there, they should leave. And actually part of the dissertation talks about this as well, like the frequency of collapses and deaths and collapses, and how some people choose to remain living there because the alternative then would be, because the state's capacity is so limited in terms of rebuilding efforts, to go to a temporary shelter, which might be a converted warehouse, a school, right? Some space that's not being used. And there's many examples where those temporary shelters, like people have been living in them for decades, in places that weren't meant to be homes, right? So even though people like invent in those spaces to try to gain some privacy, they're really not meant for that. As you can imagine, right? Co-living with other folks like leads to interpersonal problems, etc. So a lot of people, there's people, of course, that go and stay with family, right? Mm-hmm. But these shelters do exist. But I also have cases like from my research where people have chosen to remain in like partially crumbled buildings, right, in their units, rather than go to these albergues. And your first question was about record keeping. There is, and yeah, so those are another like source of data that I got was from the Havana, the property registrar in Havana, in terms of number of sales versus donations versus those swaps that I referred to earlier, the permutas. But they're largely incomplete. So, and I'm talking about the data that I got 2015 data. Well, I got it from 2011, but collected in 2016 and on a repeat trip going back a little bit later in terms of numbers, but entire municipalities will be missing, right? Or as for some years, only aggregate data for the entire year is available. Other ones it's month by month, other ones it's like month by municipality. Each municipality is supposed to register theirs and then send it to the central property registry. But then there was an issue where like one of the workers was in the hospitalized for 3 months. And so it just didn't get done for those 3 months, right? So we have holes in the data to get these like accurate estimates. And another scholar, housing scholar there, Carlos Garcia Plean, he provides some estimates, but I'm not sure like his source of the data. He's not doing primary research, but he has a lot of connections in places. So in terms, he's like the most quoted one in terms of how many housing transactions have occurred. But yeah, and that's a lot of it's like handwritten too, right? So it's lost or like some things are not added up correctly because of, I guess, handwriting and that's really
Well, unfortunately, we run out of time. There is a large number of questions that we can spend time talking about that here, but we'll bring you back when you have the book out. I also neglected to mention in the introduction that Martina is faculty at the Madison College here in Madison, and they're lucky to have you. So thank you very much for all of you to join us today, and we thank Martina again for a great presentation.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you for your question.